The following program was made possible in part by the J.W. and Cornelia Scarborough Fund, Pearl and Robert Ragsdale Fund, and Nowlin Family Fund of the Austin Community Foundation, and the Theodore P. Davis Charitable Trust, Chase Bank of Texas National Association, and Billy Ramsey, co-trustees.
The Brown Building was the center of our business activities. It was sort of the Wall Street of Austin at the time.
Lyndon put in his newsletter that he was going to be in room 718 at the Brown Building.
It's had more interesting meetings than any building outside of the Capitol that I know of.
I started my radio career in the Brown Building. I'm the young kid behind the microphone there. Austin has always been a political town. That's what makes it such an exciting place. And the Brown Building was a very exciting place back in the 40s because it's where, after the war, a lot of movers and shakers came together. I'm talking about people like Frank Erwin, Ed Clark, Jake Pickle, Lyndon Johnson. They all called Austin home. And the Brown Building was where they rubbed shoulders and cut deals and caught up on the latest rumors and maybe even fell in love. In recent years, the Brown Building has been vacant. Its offices sitting quietly, gathering dust. But if walls could talk, this building would have hundreds of stories to tell, many of which changed this town forever.
People have forgotten the glory days of the Brown Building, and that's too bad. People just don't know how much the future of Austin took place by people who planned activities within that building. But it was a fact, because that's where history was made. The Brown Building was the center of our business activities, the professional life of our city. It was one block across from the Federal Building. It was one block from the newspaper office, one block from the city hall, where the mayor and the council people always met, one block from the old Norwood Bank building. It was sort of the Wall Street of Austin at the time.
If you just went through that building, it's had probably more interesting meetings, if the walls could talk, than any building outside of the Capitol that I know of, and it's been populated by as many important, successful people, men and women, important to this community, important to this state, important to this country, and even the world. But I'm not sure that most people appreciated the significance and importance of the Brown Building on a contemporaneous basis when they were there. I'm not sure. In fact, I am sure I did not. I now appreciate it more by hindsight than I did at the time.
Jim and Betty Wilson have a very special reason to remember the Brown Building. They met and fell in love there in 1952, beginning a 46-year marriage. Jim was an up-and-coming young attorney, and Betty worked as the firm's receptionist.
When I first went with the firm, just early, from the minute I walked in almost, I was just awestruck by all these dynamic people that were there. And I hadn't been there many days until Lyndon Johnson came in, and he was then senator. And I was just amazed, but I told him he wanted to see Alvin Wirtz, and so I said, if you'd please have a seat. And I still can't believe he did have a seat, but he did. And I went in to tell Senator Wirtz that Senator Johnson was there, and he said, well, send him in.
Not all of the political action in the Brown Building was taking place upstairs in smoke-filled rooms. One of the best places in town for a little eavesdropping was the corner drugstore, where Mr. Tucker used to spot me and lots of other folks a cup of coffee if we were running low on cash.
The Brown Building had a drugstore in it, but that was the hot spot in all of Austin. Because anytime you want to get a late roomer across the street from the city hall, you'd have coffee in the Brown building. It was where the rumors started and stopped.
The corner drugstore and offices are gone, but the Brown building is once again an active and vital place. Its conversion in 1998 to downtown lofts is a result of a different kind of homecoming.
I'd bought the Brown building, actually, in the late 80s, and we anticipated returning it to a vital downtown office building. That was the dream. That was the intention. But like a lot of good intentions, sometimes the Lord says no, and circumstances were such that the project just wasn't viable at the time. And later on, as the 90s went on, it became apparent that downtown Austin, like downtown lots of places, needed more parking. And so the temptress of being able to sell this building and this lot that I'd had to carry for several years during some economic hardship and get significant remuneration and instant gratification with the parking lot was very, very seductive. But then I had to look at myself in the mirror and say, okay, Lucy, that's what your contribution to the community you love will be. Is that the way you'd like to be remembered? Is that the kind of citizen you want to be? And of course the answer was no, grump. I have no alternative. And so I had to look at the next chapter in this wonderful family album of this great building in Austin's history.
The Brown building was built in 1938 by legendary Texan Herman Brown. Brown was the founder of what became the world's largest construction firm, Brown and Root. Legend has it that Brown started his construction empire off in Temple, Texas back in 1914 when he was forced to accept a team of mules in lieu of back pay. During the Depression, Herman and his brother George Brown energetically pursued government contracts for the great public work projects of the New Deal, including the construction of the Marshall Ford Dam, now known as Mansfield Dam. They found an eager ally in a young congressman from Texas who was determined to bring electrical power to the hill country and protect Austin from the rampaging floods of the Colorado River. Their alliance was political and economic, but it also formed a friendship that lasted for years.
The Brown building had been built by George and Herman Brown, who had become friends of ours, and two more remarkable citizens, builders, dynamos, thinkers, driving, capable human beings, have not often happened in an area. I was crazy about them. Of course, they were very big figures on the landscape. Lyndon and I were very young and not important. Margaret Brown, Herman's wife, was, I guess, the first intellectual I knew. Not that she would have applied that term, or I didn't probably know that term, but she would have dinner parties at which there would be some smart people who were particularly knowledgeable about a certain subject. And she would just direct the conversation, and I would just sit there kind of open mouthed while she would elicit from everybody whatever they had of value on that subject. Her husband looked to me just like a British general, some years out of Sandhurst, had a lot of clipped mustache, white, I think, and a very forceful presence. And you were likely to be a little bit afraid of him. And which was all right, because it took strength to build, and he did build.
Herman Brown was looking for an architect to design the Brown Building, he didn't have to look too far. Just across the street stood the new federal courthouse, designed by Austin's leading architect, Charles Henry Page. Page designed many of Austin's most famous structures, including the Littlefield Building at 6th and Congress, and the streamlined Art Deco County Courthouse, which was built in 1930. Sadly, some of Page's other landmark buildings have become victims of the wrecking ball, including the old Austin National Bank building, which used to stand on Congress Avenue. The Page family has strong connections to another local landmark. Page's father, a stonemason, moved his family to Austin to work on the new Capitol building back in the 1880s. Page actually learned the trade of architecture as a young man working beside his father. A man of many talents, Page was also an avid horse lover who raced his animals at the Hyde Park track. And he was a skilled and devoted gardener who would take the time to show a young granddaughter his prized collection of then rare caladiums.
As I drive around Austin, I see a number of buildings that my grandfather designed. The courthouses, the federal courthouse and the county courthouse, the Littlefield building, our first skyscraper. And it does give me a real sense of place to see these buildings and to share this with my family. And almost daily I drive by down Colorado Street by the Brown building and think, my grandfather did that building. And it makes me very proud.
Charles Henry Page left many gifts behind to this city, buildings that shaped our lives, memories carved in stone. The Johnson family moved KTBC Radio to the Brown Building in 1943. It was a time when radio ruled the airwaves and shaped our lives. But that hasn't always been the case.
My first knowledge of radio was when I was about 11 years old, possibly 12. I went with my Aunt Effie, who raised me, as the Southern expression was, to Kansas to visit some old friends of hers. And there was many extraordinary things. Some of their friends said, come over tonight and listen to our radio. And so our hosts were eager to do that. And they took me, 11-year-old visitor, along. And it was a box sitting on a table with dials on it. But to hear, you had to put earphones on. And the earphones were passed from person to person. And at my time, it was quite distinguishable music. I was real interested and excited, but not profoundly impressed. I did not think this would be a factor in our lives, teaching us, amusing us, sharing the news, and making you laugh or and get scared and excited with the creaking door. I didn't grasp the full import, but it was an interesting thing.
When the Johnsons purchased KTBC, Lady Bird was reluctantly pressed into service to help shape the place up. Her first memories come from the days before the station moved to the Brown Building and billed itself as the strongest voice in the capital of the biggest state.
He had talked me into doing more strange jobs in my life, for which I felt no aptitude or desire to learn, especially. But you know, when you work on something a little bit, you get interested, and then you want to improve yourself and it and get on top of it. And so he asked me to go from Washington back home to Austin and look that place over that we had bought, a small radio station that was in debt to everybody in town. got down there and went around and introduced myself to every one of the staff. I remember especially Louise Vine. She was Louise Sneed at that time. She was a bookkeeper. And I asked to see the books, learned a little bit about it, and decided we ought to clean up the premises at least. So I said, Louise, are you game to let's wash these windows? So we did. I don't think they'd ever been washed since the building had been built.
It was a very meager operation, and she and I spent some time literally cleaning it up. Someone asked me one day if we painted it, and she and I did not paint it, but we did some scouring, I have to tell you. But we did it right side by side, and that's the kind of person she was. Whoever called her lady, I think, chose exactly the right word for her, because she is a lady and gracious and caring about all the people that work for her.
She was not just a co-owner along with LBJ. She was a co-worker. She was one of the group. LBJ would come in with all these plans that he had been making since he'd been laying up in bed since about 5 o'clock in the morning, and he'd come in with proposals of a dozen things to do, some of which are kind of ridiculous, and we have to listen to him. But after he'd go and hit the street and go on his business, whether it's in town or his congressional business, Lady Bird would say, well, let's concentrate on this proposal and this proposal, and she'd ignore some of the other things, and we learned to listen to her judgment.
I have never known a woman like Lady Bird Johnson, a woman who has been subjected to as much pressure as she has in her life, but to still keep her balance, still be there for her husband, and take care of the details of such a complicated lives. She's just incredible. But at the same time, with a Southern charm, very sincere charm, that wins over whomever comes into contact with her. A woman who really cares for people. A woman who loved her husband, whom I'm sure was not always easy to love. Somebody asked me what I thought was probably the most important words uttered during the Johnson administration in the White House. I said, probably the words of Lady Bird Johnson saying, now Lyndon, because she did have that soft-handed touch as far as he was concerned. And probably the best thing that ever happened to him in his life was to marry Lady Bird Johnson.
Mrs. Johnson was one of several remarkable women at KTBC. The offices were filled with bright and energetic young working girls, especially on the sales staff. Among them was the future First Lady of Texas, Nellie Connally.
They were so much fun, so lively, so pretty. I remember one little line they put together, or maybe Cactus did. Your dollar buys more at Jacob Schmidt's store. And then there was another one about funeral insurance. It's better to have it and not need it. That is, to need it and not have it. And there were a lot of laughs around the place.
Working at KTBC really was like working with an extended family, a really big family.
Lyndon Johnson's mother, who had a vast influence on his life, became the official station critic. And I think she was paid a little sum each month to critique the radio stations. And thank goodness she was a fan of mine. I would never made it otherwise. And her main criticism of my work was my grammar, which I appreciated. But every month she critiqued the station, and every month we survived.
Many young lives were lost and many families were torn apart because of the war. But morale was always high. The common goal of victory helped everyone stick together through the tough times.
There was a camaraderie of employees at KTBC, particularly with the women in the group. We spent time together socially, after hours because so many of us had either sweethearts or husbands away in the service. So we had a very common bond there, and we had a lot of fun together.
We were a close-knit group, and I don't know, maybe everybody was during the war years, those of us who were left behind or on the home front or whatever, but there was a feeling of trying to all work together to keep everything going as naturally and as calmly as possible at home, so that when all the guys came home, well, they'd have something great to come home to.
Reality provided more drama than the soap operas during the war years. The best programs often came straight from the heart. Dotti Cloud Norwood remembers one such program that she and Nellie Connally produced together.
It was letters that a wife or sweetheart or something would write to her boyfriend or her husband overseas. And these were actual letters, or parts of them were, that Nellie Connally was writing to John that she used. Of course, I'm sure they weren't verbatim, but it was significant to the times, and people were, and it was nostalgic, and it was sweet, and it was sad, and it had a lot of appeal. And at the time, I don't think I thought anything that was anything unusual. And yet, when I look back on it, to think that I was reading Nellie Connally's letters that she'd written to John just really kind of blows my mind now. But at the time, it just fit in.
Memory's a funny thing, a jumbled mess really, made up of odd fragments and moments we'll never forget. The war years were filled with those unforgettable moments. One seemed to follow the other. We remember both the heartbreak and the joy of those moments as if they were yesterday. None of us can forget where we were on December 7th, 1941. On that day, for us, for everyone, the world changed forever. For some, however, it was an especially painful day. Louise Sneed was a young UT student living at home in Hyde Park when the news came.
I'll never forget the day I heard about Pearl Harbor. I know exactly where I was and the whole situation. I was at home one Sunday afternoon, and my dad came in to tell me that he had just heard this on the radio. We lived in Hyde Park, that's where we grew up, and my brother and I. And so I remember it very well. I can still see the pain in my dad's face as he told me about this.
The pain was immediate, the danger real. For Louise had just become engaged to be married, and her fiancé, Harry Vine, was already in the service and was stationed on the West Coast. Just 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor, he had written Louise's parents asking for her hand in marriage.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Sneed, I have asked Louise to marry me during the Christmas holidays. I have always tried to accept her counsel. I need that advice and guiding power more than ever before. Whatever her answer is, I would like to feel that it was made with your knowledge, consent, and I hope blessing. I have nothing to offer Louise now but my undying love. I am resolved to go by the decision that you helped Louise reach. I await your answer. Sincerely, Harry.
Dear Harry, we have your very sweet letter concerning the welfare and future happiness of one that is dear to the three of us. Her decision is ours. So when you two have made up your minds, then we will lend our best efforts and give all the love that we have to bestow. So we make this deed of gift to you of a full 1/2 of all we have, and only ask that you love her as we have, and protect her as we have attempted to do. We extend our best wishes and tenderest love.
My parents agreed that I could go ahead and go to the West Coast at Christmas time and be married. But when I called, Harry told me that they would not even give him an overnight pass so that I couldn't come. Sadly, the next day I had a final, and that was the worst grade I ever made in the UT experience. But ultimately, he left on the 1st Combat Unit with the 41st Infantry in the South Pacific. And that was 1941, and I saw him again in October 1945. It was a long wait.
Austin has always been a political town, maybe too political. Of course, the capital is where it all happens. But a lot of happened behind the scenes, and behind the scenes was often the Brown Building. There was Lyndon Johnson and John Connally. But not as well known, but very, very powerful were people like Ed Clark, the attorney, Ralph Yarbrough, and Frank Erwin, who weren't everyday names then, but went on to be very, very powerful people. I never forget Dr. Walter Prescott Webb, the great historian, said of Ed Clark, "The most dangerous words in the English language are Ed Clark saying, 'I'm just a country boy.'" Ed Clark was to become the U.S. ambassador to Australia later in life, but back in the 40s and 50s, he was famous throughout Texas as a friend to politicians and backroom wheeler and dealer.
There was a period of time that it was said that from the standpoint of being a lawyer, that Ed Clark was maybe the most powerful lawyer in the state of Texas. The stories were that he never set foot in the Capitol, and yet from the Brown Building, in his office in the Brown Building, could get more done in the Capitol than anyone.
Frank Erwin was another powerhouse alumni of the Brown Building. He was best known as the iron-fisted chairman of the University of Texas Board of Regents in the tumultuous 1960s and 70s. Student radicals remember Erwin as a man they loved to hate for ordering trees bulldozed down to make way for new campus buildings. He was a flamboyant figure who used to drive around town in his orange and white Cadillac. You may not have liked him, but you always knew where Frank Erwin stood.
All of the politicos hung out at the Quorum Club. And Frank was a habitué there, and you could go any afternoon and Frank was going to be there. And of course, at that time, he was the political antithesis to everything that I did. And he liked me, and I liked him. It was something that was somehow more important than politics. He amused me, and I amused him, and we loved sitting together and telling each other lies and funny stories. One night, I said, "Frank, I have got to go home and be a wife and mother." And he said, "You won't like it." When I ran for county commissioner, Frank came into the headquarters, and he put a $100 bill down in the inbox on the receptionist's desk. And he said, "Now you can report that or not. If you think it'll help you, well then tell somebody, and if you think it'll hurt you, well, just forget that I was here." We had a really strong bond. And while I disagreed with a lot of Frank's party politics, and I would not have chosen the style in which Frank was able to get things done, that man literally built the University of Texas and made it of national prominence. That institution would not be half what it is today in its national recognition if Frank Erwin had not given his all to it.
Frank was a curious combination of both politician and, in many ways, an intellectual. He had a lot of trappings of being a Renaissance man. He loved opera. He loved the symphony. He could tell you about every aria that had ever been sung, every Beethoven movement. He knew all about those. His law partner, Jay Brown, told me that Frank Erwin was the best lawyer he ever knew. He said, I just am sorry, I can't keep him here practicing law. He wants to go off and do these other things. He wants to fool in politics. He wants to fool with the university.
Well, Ed Clark and Frank Erwin were the ultimate inside players. Another resident of the Brown Building was always known as the champion of the little guy. Lawyer and former United States Senator Ralph Yarbrough embodied the lonely voice of Texas liberalism for decades. Always a crusader, always ready for a fight, Ralph Yarbrough was a true hero to the young leaders of Texas.
When my husband and I were at the University of Texas, Ralph and Opal Yarbrough would have us over to their house, the young Democrats, and we were very, we were under 20. And we'd go over there and Opal would fix some kind of punch with lime sherbet and ginger ale poured on top, and we would have cookies. And we would listen to Ralph talk about where the state should be going and what kind of representation we should have in Washington. And of course, a lot of it was rancorous with what the dirty guys had done who were on the other side, who were the establishment at that time. So I really learned my politics at Ralph Yarbrough's knee. He was a really remarkable man and cared passionately about this state.
John Connally worked in the Brown Building during his days at KTBC, and then again as an attorney for one of the many powerful firms that officed there. He was the kind of guy that immediately impressed you, and everyone expected great things from him.
We always recognized Connie as a natural leader. I don't care who you were. When Connie walked in the room or was going to make a proposal, he was pretty much in charge. And you felt that he felt it so deeply and had given a lot of thought to it that his explanation or suggestion was a logical, normal thing for us to do. And he could sell you on it.
John Connally was clearly the brightest human being that I was ever around. He's the first one to have the vision. We're almost to the year 2000, and he saw the year 2000 in 1963. And I think there are people in 1998 that still don't see the year 2000. So that's the reason I say he's the most visionary person I've ever been around, but just a delightful, wonderful human being.
For a while, John Connally was the acting manager before Jess Kellum took over of KTBC Radio. He fired me about the second day there. I had asked him, new manager, here's a new chance, I'll ask him for a raise, and he turned me down. So I got on the air, turned my microphone on, and said, this is KTBC, the starvation station of the nation. Shouldn't have. And Connally called me into his office and said, did you make that station break? I said, yes. He said, you're fired. I said, well, you can't fire me. He says, why can't I? I said, you don't know enough about radio to fire me. He leaned back, gave that big Connally smile, laughed, and said, well, you're right, but don't do that again. Connally was a born leader and had a charm that few people forget, though some found it a bit distracting.
One of my early impressions at the firm was I thought John Connally was the most fabulous looking man I'd ever seen. And they finally kidded me and they said, now John, when you come in the morning, don't smile at Betty because she doesn't get any work done for about 30 minutes.
Jake Pickle holds a special place in the hearts of thousands of Central Texans. We remember him as our representative, a guy who never forgot his roots. He was a master of handshaking retail politics, and those lucky enough to tag along with him will never forget his energy and goodwill.
Jake was running for re-election, and he asked me if I would go door knocking with him, door to door. I think at the time I was probably state treasurer. I may have been county commissioner, I can't remember. And we were working West Austin, and we were knocking on doors, and it was pretty early in the morning, like about 7:30 or 8 o'clock. And we knocked on one door, and we knocked, and no one came to the door, and so we were going to leave something and go on to the next door. When the door opens, and here is a young man dripping wet with a towel wrapped around his waist, obviously in the shower. And Jake said, "Are you just getting up?" And this kind of nice college kid, you know, said, well, yes, sir, I was in the shower. And he said, well, every man in Austin got a head start on you this morning. Which, I think it was an old Lyndon Johnson expression.
Jake never missed a picnic or a parade if he could help it. And there are hundreds of kids who remember those famous pickle whistles he used to give away. Well, maybe dozens of kids. A few anyway.
One time he called me, and he wanted me to go to Luling for the watermelon thump. That was in Jake's district. And they had a parade. So he wanted to know if I would be in the parade and walk with him in the parade. And I said, sure I would. And we had these bags, and in the bag were those whistles that looked like a pickle. And so I went over and I got a bunch of those whistles, and we're walking along in the parade, and the kids are running up, and I'm handing out the whistles and saying, go home, tell your mom and daddy, be sure and vote for Jake Pickle. And Jake came over to me and he said, Ann, you're giving one of those pickles to every one of those kids that comes up. And I said, well, Jake, isn't that what we're here for? And he said, Ann, those pickles cost 13 cents a piece. He said, when I started campaigning years ago, we'd get those little bitty pickle pins, and he said, you'd get them for 4 for a penny. And he said, now I'm paying 13 cents for one of those whistles, so you don't give all those kids one. We can't afford that. This is not a big, fancy, rich campaign. And so as a consequence, I parceled out those pickles just feeling like a miser,
There were people in Washington that told me that they thought Jake was the best congressman they ever knew. Not Texas people, not Jake's friends, but people who observed him in Congress. And when I would say, why is he the best? What makes him the best? The answer was that he understands representative democracy better than anybody, that he represents an area, he represents a people, and he was a wonderful congressman. I don't believe Congress will see his like again.
If Jake Pickle was a master of retail politics, it's because he learned it from the master, Lyndon Johnson. LBJ was elected during the Great Depression. Times were tough. Folks needed help. He never forgot that, and he tried in every way to use government as a positive force to lift up the people of his district and lend them a helping hand.
One of the things I remember about the Brown building was Lyndon put in his newsletter that he was going to be in room 718 at the Brown building, and all his constituents that wanted to see him present a problem or talk about something could come see him there. First come, first served. And Mary Rather was his secretary then, and she said that as many as 100 people would come in a day in delegations from all over the 10 counties of the 10th Congressional District, or just singly. And that was a humming office. And you came across some of the best of the grassroots of American life. Representative government flourished during those early days, in my opinion. And believe me, you sure did try to help your constituents. And I still get some of the most beautiful letters, highly personal, and friendships that lasted.
Everyone remembers Lyndon Johnson in their own way, either as a friend or mentor, heavy-handed boss, a fierce combatant, the great persuader, or perhaps simply as Mr. President.
Lyndon Johnson was probably the most compelling, intriguing human being that any of us could have ever met. On a one-on-one basis, he was just overpowering. When he had a temper, it was a big temper. When he had a laugh, it was a big laugh. So he was probably all of the extremes, and someone that was just totally unforgettable for any and all of us that ever had the chance to be around him.
Right after Jack Kennedy was elected, my husband and I moved to Washington, and David worked for the Civil Rights Commission, and we were among the wave of young people who went up there to be on the new frontier. And we went to a birthday party for Mary Margaret, who was Lyndon's secretary. I had seen Lyndon Johnson on the stage, but never met him. And we were there at this party, and I looked up and looked out the window, and striding up the walkway was Lyndon Johnson. And, you know, it's sort of like meeting God. He was such an awesome figure. So he came in and he sat down and began to talk and kind of grumble about things here and there. And someone happened to mention an article that had been in the Texas Observer. Well, the Observer, if you recall, was the sort of liberal mouthpiece of Texas. And there was some piece in it that was complimentary of Johnson, and that was the story that they brought up, that something really nice was said in there. And none of us thought about it, but there was also an article in there that was derogatory. And it was something that Maury Maverick Jr. in San Antonio had said, that Lyndon couldn't be counted on, or Lyndon wasn't there at the right time to cast the vote that they needed, or something like that. And when that Texas Observer issue was mentioned, Johnson took off on a tirade that you would not have believed. He would remind them, by God, this, and he would remind them, by God, that. And I was just, you know, I was just a kid. I was very young, and I was kind of blown back in my seat by the heat of it. And that's the first time that I truly did understand the intensity that these people in power felt, and how tough it was for them to take the personal hits and the barbs, but they were willing to do it, knowing full well that they were going to take this kind of abuse. And I think about that today. There's something innate in those people that make them see, as Johnson saw, that certainly his role in history was far bigger than the personal barbs he was going to take, but my God, he was going to rail about it when he got the opportunity.
Many folks here in Central Texas watch Lyndon Johnson's career with pride and admiration. But some also wondered about what might have been. He was one of us, and we felt the weight of the many troubles of his presidency, just as we shared his triumphs. And when the spotlight faded, we welcomed him home.
I do have one precious memory of the last time I visited with him. It was just after he had been president. But it was at a Christmas party for KTVC, and I'm not an autograph seeker, but I somehow, for whatever reason, took his book and with me to that party. And I said to him, Mr. President, I brought my book. I left it in the car. I was a little embarrassed about even asking for his autograph. And I said, would it be convenient for you to give me your autograph? And so, in like fashion, he turned to Harry and he said, Harry, go get the book. And so Harry got the book. And there was a beautiful, beautiful inscription. I treasure it. I wept when I read it. It was so meaningful and dear to me. And that was the last time I saw him alive. So I have wonderful, happy, fond memories. I said to him that night, you know, my mother doesn't understand why she doesn't know you and hasn't gotten to meet you. I said, she said to me, your daddy knew the president, your brother knew the president, you have worked, you know the president, why do I not get to know him? And he said, bring your mother down to the ranch. I will just show her my ranch, just bring her down there. But then, almost prophetically, he said, but don't wait. And sadly, I waited too long. But that he was the warm kind of person that never forgot the friendship.
When I think about the Brown Building, I think about all the good times we had there, all the learning that went on, all the friendships that were made with many people who went on to do great things for this city, for this state, for this country. And I'm so delighted that the Brown Building will continue to continue to make memories, new friends, new beginnings.
The preceding program was made possible in part by the J.W. and Cornelia Scarborough Fund, Pearl and Robert Ragsdale Fund, and Nowlin Family Fund of the Austin Community Foundation, and the Theodore P. Davis Charitable Trust, Chase Bank of Texas National Association, and Billy Ramsey, co-trustees.